we are at the point in our technology stack that nobody should ever have to worry about certain core components. I've done a lot of consulting for companies on if they should open source their software, their platform, or whatever they're working on. And the question I usually ask them is, and commercial's the other kind of option to this, to have a proprietary license. But I'd actually push back on that. And the reason why is, and by the way, if you would have had this conversation with me 15 or 20 years ago, I would think I was nuts for saying what I'm about to say, which is,
and I am at no requirement to accept these changes. That's the nuance here. So now you're trying to build a business. That's not what everybody needs. That's what Ericsson needs and probably other big enterprises. My advice to a company is at that moment, we got to start drawing the line in the sand. First step.
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where we discuss all the things about the mechanics of open source in business and in communities. Follow the podcast on your favorite platform and check out season 2 episodes with Samson Gotti,
Open source is interesting.
Claire Dillon,
Great collaboration,
Wayne Starr,
Freedom,
Stephen Wally,
Good engineering,
Austin Bryan,
community,
Tom Sadler,
collaboration,
Federico Gonzalez Waite,
limitless,
Amanda Brock,
the future,
Gregory Kurtzer,
collaborative,
Michael Dexter,
freedom,
and Kelsey Hightower.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
In this segment, Gregory Kurtzer talks about how to decide if a company is ready for open source. Even in the recent past, a couple of times this license change happened. So there are a lot of single vendor open source projects out there. And at the same time, at least I personally still have a challenge to make people and companies understand sometimes that control and maintaining control over an open source project is one of the worst things that they can possibly do. Like even within projects where like the project is complex, so getting new people and companies involved is already harder because the technology itself is so complex that the bar just got raised way higher. And then you face sometimes ignorance and stubbornness with individuals who never did open source before. Like, what do you mean that I all of a sudden have to restructure my work and everything, and I have to spend time with building community and, onboard new people and all that extra overhead and things? So there are a lot of times it's not even wanting to maintain control, but maintaining control anyway by not giving it so to say away. And one of the examples that Phil and I often use is OpenStack, where Rackspace specifically set it as a goal to reduce their involvement and increase diversity in the project, and purposefully getting rid of any control that they had over the project as, one of the founding companies. So have you ever had a challenge to make someone understand why this is important?
absolutely. There's a lot of perspectives in this, and one of the biggest challenges is, well, I guess the first thing I should just mention is there's a ton of companies out there. There's a lot of companies out there that are using the commercial open source or core open source business model or development model, and every company, every organization, every individual is going to do what they think is the right thing with the data that they have, and they're going to make the best decisions that they can. and always assume best intentions. So with that being said, there's a number of companies that have done this fairly recently, even. HashiCorp is one that obviously comes to mind. And I think HashiCorp has been just generally just such a wonderful company overall. Like I worked with a lot of people at HashiCorp, and I think they're fantastic individuals. I've traded emails with the CEO numerous times, and everybody there, I mean, I have a huge amount of admiration and respect for. Um, and at the same time, they're making the decisions that they need to make what's best for the company. Now, when a company has a single vendor project, right? So they're the only vendor in that project, it becomes an option to how can they leverage the community in such a way to help gain revenue, to help build the value of the company. And, this is a very difficult decision. Like, I don't fault any company that has done this, because it's a very difficult decision to manage and to navigate. Because again, if that company is not successful, then the open source project suffers. So it's in our interest to make sure that company is successful. But if there's an option for that company to hold it hostage, and again, I use that word kind of lightly, but I don't mean it lightly. We don't want to give companies that option, to be clear. Like, I don't want companies to have that option, maybe is a better way of saying it. I understand why they do. Believe me, I've been there, done that. I understand why they do. But from an open source perspective, from a community perspective, it's not advantageous to the community. I guess you can argue that from an open source perspective, it's better than commercial. And commercial is the other kind of option to this, to have a proprietary license. But I'd actually push back on that. And the reason why is, and by the way, if you would have had this conversation with me 15 or 20 years ago, I would think I was nuts for saying what I'm about to say, which is, if a company is not okay with the community running their open source project, I'd actually prefer to see that product being commercial, not being an open source license in many cases. And I think now companies are open sourcing things for the name that it's open source in name only in many cases. And it's not truly an open source project. And I want to encourage companies. There is nothing wrong with having a commercial product. Nothing at all. Please don't feel like you have to open source it, especially if you do not believe in what you're doing from an open source perspective, because at some point you may change your mind and you're going to end up with alienating the open source community. And the one thing I can say is, if you do end up alienating the open source community, there is not one single company, in my belief, not one single company that is big enough and powerful enough to overcome the negative effect of the open source community. Right? Of course, it depends on what projects you're working and whatnot, but in general, the open source community is bigger than every company out there. And if you piss off the open source community wholesale, you're going to have a really hard time as a company. And when companies change their open source model and take something that was open source that people were counting on, and you change that and you now make it commercial, or you limit how you're doing it, or you use a different license that's not truly open source, you're alienating a lot of people within the open source community. And it's just better not to do that. There's no harm in proprietary software. Keep it proprietary if you're not sure that open source is the right thing. And the last point I'll make on this is the way that I've done a lot of consulting for companies on if they should open source their software, their platform, or whatever they're working on. And the question I usually ask them is, would you be happy about your competitor making more money and being more successful with your open source project than you are? And if the answer is yes, join the club. You're ready for open source. If the answer is no, keep it proprietary.
In this segment, Kelsey Hightower talks about the sustainability of the open source ecosystem and how to decide which project to create a business around.
Do you have a take on what's been going on with the start with an open source license, move to a business source license, or to something less open and less free to use than otherwise as an industry trend? Do you come down one side or the other on that one?
So I'll talk about the nuance. And I'll just start like something that I have maybe direct empathy for. And I just gave a keynote at the Linux Open Source Summit. And I covered a little bit of this topic, but I'll rephrase some of it here for the audience. I contributed to Terraform in the early days when it was Mitchell Hashimoto, Armon, and Hacker was one of their tools. I remember making contributions there. Terraform, I think I was one of the first people to write before I was working at Google, the provider for GCP, because we were using it at Puppet Labs. And so I see myself as a big part of that community. I've spoken at a lot of their conferences. I know the team members there, have a relationship with these people. And so one day you see they changed the license. And that license change, depending if you signed a contributor's license agreement or not, means they relicense your stuff too. In the case of Terraform, not so much, because I think the providers are different. Plus, there's a different provider anyway. Now, personally, I literally don't care. Just from personally speaking, I made those contributions back when I needed to use those things. I made them at that point in time, and I made them for anyone to do anything with. Anyone. Fork it, reuse it, rename it, just doesn't matter. I was giving it away. I also understood that those projects aren't mine. They're HashiCorp's, trademark and everything. I think a lot of people are confused about this ain't ours. A lot of people are like, oh, this is art. No, it's not yours at all. These things typically have funding sources. They have maintainers who are ultimately responsible. They have legal trademarks and they have licenses, all subject to change. Company can be bought out, people move on, people change governance model. All this stuff is just temporary. So you think your community is great and immune to all of this? You are fooling yourselves. Because the ultimate responsibility of the community is to be prepared to hit the fork button and then do what's necessary for that thing to live on with the governance model you want. Most people ain't trying to do that. Why? Because you can't do that for free forever. You can't. And this is the nuance here, because I've had a open source project that other people use, even commercial entities. And it's really hard as a maintainer to wake up on a Saturday and see a GitHub issue from a profitable company that pays you $0 that would like a timeline on when this is going to be fixed. I'm looking around like, no. This is not my priority. It's like, well, Kelsey, you're not being good open source steward. It's like, Kelsey ain't working for free. And I am at no requirement to accept these changes. That's the nuance here. So now you're trying to build a business. I think a lot of these projects have no business trying to build a business. Some of this stuff ain't a business. Like imagine a business around grep and vim. Stop it. I'm sorry. These are, do they add value? Absolutely, they add value. But it doesn't mean it's a business. I think Netflix has this problem too. Can every movie make it as a standalone Blu-ray disc for sale at Walmart? Absolutely not. Some of these B movies, I'm not paying $15 for the B. We're just not doing that. And so then it's not sustainable. But what is sustainable, if you look at the Netflix model, is that some big stuff and some small stuff maybe get funding, but doesn't have to necessarily be a hit or even profitable to exist. Because if profitability was the only way things could exist, then we wouldn't have a lot of things. So a lot of open source projects, some people get to do in their free time and share. That's beautiful. I love those. But I think the mistake happens when things that should just stay that way, you try to build a business. And this is where I think it gets complicated. It's not just enough to have a great set of engineers doing great technical things. You need marketing. You need sales. You probably need HR if the team gets big enough. You need to actually deal with clients and procurement. It gets so crazy that before you know it, you'll have way more overhead trying to sell the software than the people who build it. That is just what happens in business. And a lot of people don't understand that. So in order for it to be sustainable, someone's got to buy the software. The trick with open source, it starts off for free. And it's competitive out here. If you don't have enough value out of the gate, and typically these projects are trying to challenge incumbents. I haven't seen stuff that just lets you do a thing that has never done before. Most of this stuff is like, here's how to do a thing a better way. And so I still have the option of just doing what I'm already doing. So now the only thing you really can compete on is typically price. So some projects struggle to give software away for free. If you're struggling to give it away, you should probably not start a business on it. Then if you are having success giving it away, then understand that it may only work because it's $0. The moment you try to charge for it is when you start to find out, from my experience, people rarely pay for things that they don't have to. Hey, free cars. Should I get the free car or should I pay $50,000 for the same car? This is so challenging. It's not. Free is hard to beat. It doesn't even have to be good. When it's free, like free food, it's free. It's okay. Like I went to school when I was in elementary, they gave me a peanut butter and honey sandwich on wheat bread. It was free. It was good, but I'm not paying $10 for peanut butter, honey on wheat bread. It's $10. It doesn't add up. And so what happened to HashiCorp is interesting because they make it all the way to IPO, the dream for any company. And all we know is they made all of this money. But then when you start to see the revenue numbers, things are adding up. And someone explained to me when I was working at Google, the challenge about working at a company like Google, if one year you report $20 billion in earnings, they want to see $24 billion next year. They want 20% growth over growth every year. So before you know it, enough time goes by, you make $100 billion. You better not show up next year with $99 billion. I need $120 billion. And if you don't get that, we got to start rethinking this thing. So now HashiCorp's in that boat. We love the company. We love the software. I think there was a little bit of cracks in the governance model. I think they started to do some Nginx-like things where you're trying to contribute something, but it competes with the commercial endeavor.
Yeah.
And so there's not a release valve. Where do they go? Kubernetes did a different approach there. Kubernetes was like, here's an extension interface. CRDs, custom resource definitions. Here's the core. And here's a first class, almost hard to tell the difference between the two. And you can go do whatever you want. It can be proprietary, or it can be open, but you don't necessarily have to get permission from the core community to improve it. Because the cloud providers were competing on a whole different dimension.
Yep.
I think HashiCorp, like Nginx back in the day, for some of their projects, decided to have this governance model that kind of kept some contributions at bay when they started to compete with commercial. Nothing's worse than lock in than lock out. If all those features would have landed, people would have stood there. But the moment you say what I can't do, that's when things start to feel a little uneasy. And so you get to that plus a combination of having to grow revenue and hard to do that when people don't have to pay, you start doing unnatural things. And look, to be fair, I read the license. It said, unless you're trying to compete with us as a commercial entity for the most part, you still get to use the software under the original terms we had before. So the average person, even working at a company as a consumer downstream, technically, nothing changed. But ethically, we all saw the danger signs. What do you mean? The competitor I've chosen as a technology partner can no longer make improvements that you may or may not make. What's going on here? Is this just the first step? What happens when you tell me that I can't even write Terraform code without paying you some type of fee? We saw this with like some of the stuff Oracle was doing in some of their products. We don't like the way this smells. This really feels bad for us, mainly how it's communicated. And so think all things equal. People don't like when you switch things up without a clear communication line.
In this segment, Gregory Kurtzer talks about creating the Chaos Foundation and how it related to commercial interest in open source.
in my personal opinion, I think there's probably significantly more open source than there should be. And when we talk about open source, this is where I think it's important, at least from my own sanity, to very clearly separate open source as a license type versus collaborative development as a method of actually creating a software artifact or an IP artifact, right? And Linus, just in the last year or two, actually did an interview with the CEO of Intel, and he commented on this. And his sense was, I don't like any environments where it's clear that the value received from that community or collaborative effort is lopsided in some way. Meaning that somebody who's not putting as much in is getting much more out, or that there's a level playing field that anybody can take this and do with it as they want in the direction that they want to take it. And so, yeah, I have a big problem with what I refer to as bait and switch licensing, because if your point is to build, to call it open source to the point that you have enough people depending on it, that you can actually flip them over to a commercial model, then I find that disingenuous. And I find that to be just not a good practice. And yes, and we've seen it frequently. And I think there's been a pretty strong trend to, just like CentOS, to fork and to create something that maintains that same path of value, but do so in a continued collaborative and open way, as opposed to moving to a commercial model. And I consider it a threat. I put it not that far from malware, as far as what you can't trust as a user, because most likely you're not able to use that project like you had anticipated, and what your plans were, what your roadmap from a technology standpoint looks like, and how much you're spending, and where you're investing both time and money and resources, people and money, to actually make whatever solution you're actually out to make. So yeah, I consider it a pretty significant problem.
I wholeheartedly agree. And this is why we did chaos so differently, and ensured that it was separate. We created a foundation from scratch to manage this, because we felt as though we're actually trying to manage a slightly different problem than I think many of the other foundations out there have done, which is to better cross-pollinate commercial interests into open source. Like the operating system is just such a clear area of focus where we need to be creating an open and absolutely stable foundation. We are at the point in our technology stack that nobody should ever have to worry about certain core components. And is that going to go away? Or am I going to have to go pay for that? Or am I going to need a license something for that? Like, running your operating system is one of these core, critical, foundational components that I just believe we all are running into the exact same issues. Everyone, competitors, everybody. We're all running into the same issues. And that those issues are not where our business value lie. So as a result, if we collaborate where we're not adding value from a business perspective, it makes sense, right? There's no business value in it anymore.
Or the value is in the collaboration, right? The value is in the interoperability, or the value is somewhere around there. So I often dislike to hear open source has no differentiated value. It doesn't have that. I don't find that to be true, but it's a different kind of value, right? And for me, yeah, anything in the platform space, like Linux, like Kubernetes, like OpenStack, these are very fundamental platforms on top of which you can go 1,000 different directions from a solution standpoint, and you all have the same problem. You need to start with a platform, and it's really helpful if it runs the same in lots of different places.
I think that's a great point. Exactly.
Yeah, and like people very often kind of talk about open source like, this is free software. If I contribute back, then I give things away. This is charity. All the things that have nothing to do with their product development, that have nothing to do with maintenance, that have nothing to do with the business value or anything like that. And we've been talking to a few people and just kind of looking into how the language around open source evolves in the corporate and commercial space, because we can't really talk about contribution anymore. We have to talk about investment. We have to talk about risk. We have to talk about return on investment. We have to talk about maintenance. So when we are talking about value, like if you're maintaining a piece of software that you rely on, everybody else relies on, that does not, as you both pointed out, bring the actual business value to the company, then doing the maintenance all together with everybody else, that will bring the maintenance cost down if you actually do it right. It will also reduce your risk if you're maintaining something upstream, because then you know exactly what's coming down the pipe, as opposed to depending on everybody else maintaining the software correctly or safely enough, or whichever way you want it to go. But somehow, when it comes to this collaborative software development model, all these things don't really seem to land with companies. A lot of times, in my experience, it's really hard to convince anybody to do anything else than throw their feature over the fence. And then watching it land, hopefully in the spot where they envisioned, that roughly happens, and then they are just out. And sometimes they complain that the feature didn't land fast enough, and complain about, things not happening the way they wish they would, but they don't have the bandwidth to do it. They don't have this, they don't have that. And on the other hand, if you look at things like review bandwidth within any community, like that doesn't just magically appear there. That's all from those individuals who are investing their time, if it's something that they are doing on their own interest, or individuals working in the community on behalf of a company who are investing their time, and the company investing, their people into that project for a very good reason. But somehow that's just not how the conversation goes very, very often. In this segment, Kelsey Hightower talks about how startups can build a business strategy around open source.
You had mentioned that you're advising some startups. Do you have an opinion on the whole, how do you build a business model around an open source project? I'm assuming it's open source projects to product, I think is the phrase you used.
Yeah, there's a couple of proprietary ones.
Okay.
When I advise my startups, I'll tell them, the early startups, there used to be this thing, and still a thing in VC world, don't worry about revenue. I'm like, I don't understand a business world like that. You have to be thinking about revenue if you want to build a business. Sure, maybe you can have a little runway before that first set of customers need to come in. But if you're not thinking about how it's going to be packaged and priced and whether people will pay for it or not, it's crazy. And I'll give you a good example. Imagine you open source a project and it's starting to get a little popular. And then you start getting some big users like the Ericssons of the world. And they show up and say, hey, we really love this. We're going to start shipping this in our big equipment. Problem is, we need a few features. We need FedRAMP compliance and something else. And you say, whoa, stop. That's not what everybody needs. That's what Ericsson needs, and probably other big enterprises. My advice to a company is at that moment, we got to start drawing the line in the sand. First step, put in a hook or at least build instructions where a customer could do this themselves. If someone were to do it themselves, we should take that contribution as long as they promise to maintain it. If we have to do it ourselves, then that might be the first enterprise version, mainly because not everyone needs it and you need it. And so we're going to add it in a way where you can totally pay for that. If you want us to do the work at a priority schedule, then we got to negotiate some type of contract to pay for the resources to build it, support it, and do all the things that you want. Because we know next year, if there's a problem, I got to stand behind that software. And so the first thing I would do is just have a clean interface where anyone can do it. This is what we did in the Kubernetes project when we wanted to have deeper authorization integrations with like IAM cloud providers or your own LDAP system. We built a hook in the core, and then everyone could do their own implementations. And if you wanted GCP's implementation, you paid for it in the managed service. But if you wanted your own implementation, you do the work and you can totally integrate just like everyone else. I think that's the best balance. And the last thing I'll say here is what I've learned is most companies, if you told them what to pay for, they tend to buy it. Professional services is usually the thing most companies need, not a product license. We need education. Who's going to train all of these people? We need support. Those first 2 years are critical. I don't really care about your software license. We know it's not 100% finished, but the more critical thing in those early stages for these early open source projects is support, knowledge transfer, and training. Sometimes you got to do some of that work before we can get to the product-led growth. And I think going forward, we're going to find out that a lot of people are going to be a little bit more hesitant about open sourcing the whole thing out of the gate, and probably have a better strategy on what's free and what's product to start with, or they just won't be able to compete. And what will be left is just the big companies like the Facebooks, Googles of the world being able to fund open source projects that don't need to be profitable. And that seems like that would be a very limited world, because the software we're talking about now ain't grep and Vim. We're talking about full-blown distributed systems that need more than like 10 people to work on them.
Yeah, I find this space actually very complicated, right? Because I think if in today's world, if you have a point application and you try to put a database or what have you, and you try to put it out just as a proprietary product, because there's something close enough that's free, I'm going to go with the free one. It's good enough, right? So I see the problem of trying to have a startup where that's the competition, right? But you know, as I do, that even when you try to upfront say, here's the open source project and here's my commercial offering, particularly if you try to do that early, then you are going to limit others who want to contribute something that you consider a commercial feature. And that's when you start to run into that problem. Well, now it's in that open source side of the fence and not in my proprietary license.
I mean, I think as long as the value is complete, because think about it, Chrome is open source. Most people have never paid for it, but it is attached to a huge commercial endeavor. But the split is right. But I can see what you mean, because if you start to say Chrome Enterprise versus Chrome open source, and the open source one is hobbled, then yeah, I think people do get turned off if you get that split wrong.
Yeah, and I think it does end up boiling down for me is the value you provide as a company can't be tied to the software or can't be directly in the software, right? It's some value above and beyond. And you named a lot of them, right? It's training, it's support, it's customizations that are quite unique to you as a company. But I think, in my experience, open source does best when it's a platform that everybody needs and they build their own differentiation on top of. But that interoperability and that speed of innovation of a Linux or of a Kubernetes or of an OpenStack, right? Lots of different use cases, lots of different places you can take it. Apache, another great example, right? Nobody had a good success story in creating even support around Apache. It's just everybody used it, and Nginx is kind of following behind as well. In the same sense, it's those platforms do really well in an open source ecosystem. Point applications, I always struggle with. It's like, why did we create that in open source to begin with? And if nobody did, then there would be a good proprietary marketplace for them. But that's not the world we live in. Somebody's going to try to do this open source thing first, and that just makes the decision for everybody else really complicated. I don't know an easy way out of it. And now, as you know, like everything is open source, right? So
I think we've seen a world where open for proprietary software works like gaming. Most games you pay for, and that's proprietary software, and it works. Movies, if you want to consider, and music, those are kind of software in many ways on how we consume them, and they also are proprietary. I pay for QuickBooks; it's proprietary. I pay for my little camera app that I'm streaming to you on now. I'm using this Cameo thing. I literally paid for it because of the value it brings to me. So I paid for it because I kind of want to see that team do well. But I think you're right. Infrastructure is a little different. Like roads and highways, they're so important that we know they need to exist regardless of the company behind them exists. What's that old Bill Gates quote? It's banking is important, but banks aren't. And I think that's where a lot of these projects are when it comes to networking, compute, and these things. And I think a good example would be Let's Encrypt. I remember when you used to have to pay like $100 to $400 for an SSL certificate. And then Let's Encrypt comes along, not as a new upstart with a ton of funding, hoping to go IPO, but this group of people who realize that this is critical infrastructure. And when you go look at the donors and the sponsors, they also understand this. And the best model so far, and I would have to talk to the team to see if it's still good, but it seems to be working, where we fund the right people so they can focus on that problem. And it just solves a very critical thing. That PKI infrastructure where your browser trusts them to sign certificates and websites can now get them rotated in a timely manner, and it's damn near effectively $0 for the entire world to get these things that are really critical to the internet. That is a really great model. So maybe in the future, we see more open source projects have a funding model that looks a lot more like Let's Encrypt and maybe what VCs are doing. But I just hope, because we got things like Docker through the VC model. We got things like Terraform through the VC model. So I wonder, can we find a sustainable source of funding for these big ideas that may or may not work? But I agree with you. It's going to be hard to have an infrastructure project that tries to capture value in the software stack because competitions are waiting.
In this segment, Gregory Kurtzer talks about how companies sometimes use the promise of open sourcing a piece of software as a marketing tool. I think open source as a license type is one aspect. Open source as collaborative development is another aspect. And I think many companies who are throwing things out to be open source, that's open source as a marketing strategy aspect and just growing their ecosystem. And then once they gained enough, they just close the door, which is, that makes me very angry when people use open source that way, because that not just kind of muddies the water, but it gives a bad reputation to open source to all those people and companies who are new, because, we have new generation of people and humans, and we have new generation of companies, so there will be always someone to whom the concept is new, and if their first experience is seeing something like happen, then how could I blame them to come to the very wrong conclusion of, if this is open source, then this is BS, and I don't want to be part of it. This is, that's weird, and not understanding why anybody else would do it. And I can't blame them. If that's what you saw as a first example, then I would walk away probably too. And I also wonder if this kind of license switch ever really worked out for someone on the long run. I don't know if you all know, or anyone out there who's listening or watching, comment below if you do, because it's one thing to look at a company like HashiCorp. They did it a year ago or two now, year and a half, not that long ago. So I think it's too early to tell whether or not it was actually a great idea to do or not, because it's one thing to have the short-term business gain, and it's another thing what happens 10 years from now. It's like, was it really a good idea? So it would be interesting to know what happened with those who did this, like, I don't know, 10 years ago or 15 or something. Like, where did you actually go? Were you successful long term, or you had to pivot to do something else once the fast gain just kind of died out? I would really be interested in seeing that. And the other thing, I don't remember which one of you were mentioning this, asking the company if they are okay with the competitor being more successful. I remember asking that from the business development person of a couple of companies, and they kind of give you the answer they think you want to hear, and then you see the company not actually following up on that. And I keep smiling under my non-existent mustache that, like, you still have a way to go to actually understand why I asked the question and why you have to mean what you actually said. Because saying, oh, yeah, sure, that's not gonna cut it.
There was a slight tangent, but just an interesting story. There's a company, I'm not going to name drop them, but it's a storage company for high performance computing, and they promised that they would open source their client side drivers For a long time, when I was with the Department of Energy, we bought a bunch of these systems under the promise that they were going to do open source these client drivers. That was like 10, 12 years ago. Still hasn't happened. Like, so there's the other side of this as well, where companies are promising and promoting their product with the understanding that something will be open source. And again, in hindsight, I think they would have had a better messaging if they just said, well, it's not our intention right now to open source it. Who knows what the future will bring, but right now it's commercial, because then it sets the expectation, and then you're not doing the bait and switch as you mentioned. And I've also called it open source is not a marketing switch. You can't turn it on and turn it off without having negative repercussions. So if somebody truly wants to open source something, they better be really sure that that's what they want and that's what's best for their business. And open source is not a business model. All right. It's a development model. It is a collaboration model. We've got to be thinking about this correctly if we're going to be making, informed decisions about it.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for Season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned, because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget, bullet, but no silver budget as well? Silver budget that is.
That's
a silver
what you
bullet.
need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it. Simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that, I don't know if you